Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that's both tender and thought-provoking. The long, often overlooked history of people born with Down syndrome. From ancient societies where their presence was misunderstood, to more recent decades of stigma, progress, and advocacy, this journey reveals not only how far we've come, but how much further we still need to go to ensure every life is seen as valuable and full of potential. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before there were textbooks, hospitals, or genetic science, there were only human eyes, watching, wondering, interpreting the world through myth, emotion, and instinct. In this distant past, the arrival of a child who looked or behaved differently evoked deep, often spiritual reactions. We don't have written accounts from these ancient times describing what we now call Down syndrome. But archaeology gives us rare, moving glimpses. In 2014, a team of researchers in France uncovered a 1,500-year-old burial site. Among the remains was a young child with distinct cranial features, matching those of Down syndrome. This child, despite their differences, was buried with care, not cast out or discarded, but laid gently to rest in the same sacred manner as others in the community. It's a small detail, but a powerful one. What it suggests is that long before medical terms were invented, some people responded not with fear, but with acceptance. In a world without diagnoses, perhaps this child was simply seen as a quieter soul. Maybe they were carried more often, spoken to more softly. Maybe they were loved, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. In other ancient cultures, physical and intellectual differences were often interpreted through a spiritual lens. Some were revered as having a special connection to the divine. Others, sadly, were misunderstood, feared, or shunned. Without a framework to understand conditions like Down syndrome, the reaction largely depended on the culture, the time, and the temperament of the surrounding people. The fact that we've found more than one ancient burial like this, including possible cases in ancient Rome and the Andes, tells us something quietly profound. People with Down syndrome have always been part of the human family. Always. Their presence is not a modern phenomenon. It is not a flaw to be corrected or a problem to be solved. It is part of the natural diversity of life, a thread woven into the human story since the beginning. These ancient burials whisper to us across time. They say, "I was here, I mattered, I was not forgotten." And as we journey deeper into history, we'll see how that whisper was sometimes drowned out, and how it slowly found its voice again. As we step into the classical world, ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, India, and beyond, we enter civilizations rich with myth, philosophy, and symbolism. In these societies, difference wasn't always interpreted medically. Instead, it was often understood through metaphor, religion, and mystery. People who looked or acted differently were often cast in symbolic roles. Some were seen as touched by the gods, vessels of divine will, omens, or cosmic messengers. Others were viewed with suspicion, seen as signs of imbalance, impurity, or ancestral sin. In either case, individuals with cognitive or physical differences were rarely just people. They were symbols. This was the world before genetics, before science. So, if a child was born with Down syndrome, soft facial features, slower speech development, a gentler demeanour, their presence might spark stories rather than diagnoses. Some cultures believed such children were blessed, closer to the spirit world. Others feared they carried bad luck or divine punishment. In Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions, myths included tales of children born under strange stars or touched by divine forces. There's no clear reference to Down syndrome in these texts, but they reflect a worldview where difference was interpreted as fate or prophecy. Sometimes that brought reverence, sometimes exile. What's important to remember is this: there was no single way of responding. In some villages, a child with visible differences might be raised in the heart of the home, watched over with gentleness. In others, they might be hidden, excluded, or abandoned. Everything depended on the culture's worldview and the hearts of the people nearby. For example, in some ancient Hindu texts, children born with certain characteristics were seen as manifestations of karmic cycles, lives returning in new forms to teach, to heal, or to be healed. While this didn't always translate to inclusive care, it did offer a framework that acknowledged spiritual value in every soul. Still, the truth remains. Without medical understanding, people with Down syndrome were largely left vulnerable to superstition and social control. They weren't yet seen as fully human in the modern sense, not in rights, not in protection, and not in opportunity. They lived on the edges of society, sometimes elevated, sometimes feared, but rarely understood. And that misunderstanding would linger for centuries, reinforced by religion, cloaked in folklore, and later, repackaged by science. The Middle Ages brought with them a cloak of silence, especially for those who lived outside the boundaries of what society considered normal. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, as Europe transitioned from ancient empires to feudal kingdoms, the treatment of people with intellectual disabilities became increasingly shaped by religious dogma, social hierarchy, and fear of the unknown. Children born with Down syndrome in medieval Europe entered a world ruled by strict beliefs. The Church held immense influence, and deviations from the norm were often interpreted through a lens of sin and punishment. A child who did not speak like the others, who learned slowly, or who had distinct facial features might be seen not simply as different, but as evidence of divine disfavor, or worse, demonic influence. In rural villages, news of such a birth could spread quickly. Whispers would fill the streets. Was it the mother's fault? Had the family sinned? Was this child a punishment, a test, or a warning? Because there was no scientific framework to explain genetic conditions, imagination filled the void, and imagination, when guided by fear, often leads to cruelty. Many of these children were hidden from view. They might be raised quietly at home, kept indoors, rarely seen in public. Some were given over to monasteries or convents, where the religious were tasked with caring for the sick and the vulnerable. In some cases, this offered safety, food, shelter, and a quiet life. In others, it meant institutional isolation, far from family or affection. But the medieval world wasn't entirely heartless. There are fragments of compassion tucked within these centuries. Certain religious orders saw every soul as sacred, regardless of ability. There are recorded instances of monks referring to people with intellectual disabilities as innocents, spiritually pure, closer to God. In those rare cases, kindness was extended, even if full inclusion remained out of reach. Still, for most, this was an age of silence. Without language to describe Down syndrome, without community support or advocacy, families were left to navigate the unknown alone. Their stories went unwritten, their lives mostly undocumented. They were present, always, but history passed them by, leaving only traces in artwork, parish records, or burial sites. And yet, even in this shadowed age, they endured, quietly, waiting for a world that could one day see them clearly. Though the medieval period is often remembered for its cruelty toward those who were different, not every story is one of fear, rejection, or superstition. Hidden among the darker pages of history are moments of quiet compassion, acts of care that defied the norms of the time and revealed the enduring humanity of the people who lived it. In small communities and remote villages, families sometimes responded to a child born with Down syndrome, not with shame, but with acceptance. These were not people with access to science or support systems. They were farmers, craftspeople, mothers, and fathers, responding not as scholars, but as parents. And for some of them, love won over fear. We know this from rare records of midwives, healers, and religious figures who wrote of gentle or slow children who were deeply cherished by their families. In monasteries, where many with disabilities were placed, either by choice or necessity, some religious caretakers developed relationships that transcended societal expectations. A monk or nun might teach such a child simple prayers, provide consistent meals, or simply offer the tenderness of presence. In these isolated cases, people with Down syndrome were allowed to grow, however slowly, at their own pace. They may not have been schooled in the traditional sense, but they were included in daily rhythms, helping in gardens, participating in worship, or assisting with household tasks. Their value wasn't measured by productivity, but by being. We also find hints of compassion in art. Medieval paintings occasionally depict figures with features resembling Down syndrome, often as angels, shepherds, or humble saints. Whether the artists were intentionally portraying individuals with the condition or simply inspired by those they knew, the message endures. They were part of the human story, and sometimes even part of its beauty. Of course, we can't romanticize this era. These acts of kindness were not common policy, but exceptions to a harsher rule. Most individuals with Down syndrome still faced exclusion, mockery, or invisibility. But the exceptions matter. They remind us that even in the most rigid and fearful times, there were always people willing to see differently. People who looked past superstition and status. People who chose to care. Not because they had to, but because something in them refused to do otherwise. And in these simple, defiant acts of compassion, the future began to take root. As Europe emerged from the medieval period and stepped into the scientific curiosity of the 17th and 18th centuries, the way society viewed people with disabilities began to shift. Faith and superstition slowly made room for observation and classification. It was the dawn of modern medicine, and with it came a new kind of attention: the medical gaze. For centuries, individuals with Down syndrome had existed on the margins, whispered about, cared for in silence, or ignored altogether. But in 1866, a British physician named John Langdon Down changed that. Working at the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots in Surrey, he published a paper titled Observations on an Ethnic Classification of Idiots, in which he described a group of patients who shared certain distinct features: almond-shaped eyes, a rounder face, a shorter stature, and gentle behavior. He didn't know the cause. Chromosomes hadn't been discovered yet, but he saw a pattern. And so, unintentionally, he gave the world the first medical description of what we now call Down syndrome. His language, however, reflected the prejudices of his time. Langdon Down compared his patients to people of Mongolian ethnicity, a term he used based on outdated racial theories that were sadly common in Victorian science. He called the condition Mongolism, a label that would linger, painfully, for over a century. Though offensive by today's standards, it's important to recognize that Langdon Down's intentions weren't rooted in cruelty. In fact, compared to many of his peers, he believed in humane care. He emphasized kindness, structure, and dignity for his patients, even as the system they lived in remained deeply flawed. With his paper, something both powerful and problematic began. People with Down syndrome were now seen as a type, a diagnosable category. This had consequences. On one hand, it allowed researchers to study the condition, eventually leading to medical advances. On the other, it reduced individuals to a diagnosis, a set of traits, an object of study. For the first time, people with Down syndrome were no longer invisible. But now, they were being watched, analysed, classified. Their humanity? Still often overlooked. Still, this moment marked a turning point. The road to understanding had begun, and though that road would pass through some very dark places in the years to come, it also laid the groundwork for discovery, advocacy, and eventually, empowerment. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, The industrial world was booming. Cities were expanding, technology was advancing, and systems were being built to organize nearly every aspect of human life. Among these were institutions, sprawling facilities designed to house people who didn't quite fit the mold of a rapidly modernizing society. For individuals with Down syndrome, these institutions became both a refuge and a prison. Families, especially those in working-class communities, were told by doctors, clergy, or local officials that their child would be better off in a specialized facility. These institutions promised safety, structure, and expert care. But the reality was often far grimmer. Many of these places were overcrowded, underfunded, and severely lacking in trained staff. Children with Down syndrome were placed alongside individuals with vastly different conditions, from mental illness to severe physical disabilities. There was little personalization, even less understanding, and almost no opportunity for growth. Residents wore uniforms, followed rigid schedules, and had little say in their daily lives. For decades, this system was seen as progressive. In fact, some families believed they were doing the right thing, sparing their children from the stigma and struggle they might face in the outside world. But for the children themselves, the experience was one of disconnection. They were removed not only from society, but from their families, their communities, and often their sense of self. Institutionalization also allowed the broader public to ignore the existence of people with Down syndrome. Out of sight became out of mind. Schools didn't adapt, workplaces didn't accommodate, and the myth persisted that these individuals couldn't learn, couldn't grow, and didn't belong. There were exceptions, of course. A few institutions offered genuine care, where staff treated residents with patience and warmth. Some children formed lasting friendships, even family-like bonds, with one another and with the rare caregivers who saw their value. But these were islands of light in a sea of systemic neglect. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this era is how many bright, kind, and capable individuals lived their entire lives behind locked doors. Not because they were dangerous, but because the world wasn't ready for them. This chapter in history is a sobering one, but it's also a setup, because the tide would eventually turn, and the people once hidden away would begin to step into the light, not alone, but with their families, advocates, and a voice the world could no longer ignore. As the 20th century unfolded, science and medicine continued to progress, but not always in the right direction. What should have been a time of growing understanding for people with Down syndrome became, instead, a period where cold theories and dangerous ideologies stripped away humanity. This was the age of eugenics. Born out of a misguided desire to improve the human race, the eugenics movement took hold in many parts of the world. It wasn't confined to fringe thinkers. It was embraced by governments, doctors, universities, and public health campaigns, all under the pretense of science. People with Down syndrome were labelled as unfit, defective, and a burden on society. The logic was chilling. If certain traits were seen as undesirable, then perhaps they could be prevented or eliminated through sterilization, institutionalization, or selective breeding. And so, in countries like the United States, Canada, Sweden, and the UK, laws were passed that allowed the forced sterilization of individuals with intellectual disabilities. Many young women and men with Down syndrome were unknowingly or forcibly sterilized without consent, often under the guardianship of the state. They were denied the right to parenthood, to family life, or even to basic bodily autonomy. The very things that make us human, love, connection, choice, were systematically denied. But nowhere was this ideology more violently applied than in Nazi Germany. Under Adolf Hitler's regime, the concept of a pure race took on horrifying consequences. The so-called T4 program targeted children and adults with disabilities, including Down syndrome, for extermination. Thousands were taken from their families and murdered in clinics masquerading as hospitals. Some were starved, others were poisoned by gas or lethal injection. Their deaths were hidden in bureaucracy, listed as pneumonia or heart failure. Their names were erased their existence declared life unworthy of life. These acts were not crimes of war, they were policy, and they were carried out in the name of progress. This chapter in history must never be forgotten. It is a brutal reminder of how easily science, when divorced from ethics and compassion, can be used as a weapon. But even in those darkest days, there were people, parents, nurses, quiet resistors, who fought to protect these lives, who saw their worth, who whispered the truth the world refused to hear. They are the ones who planted the seeds of the resistance that would follow. In the heart of Nazi Germany, beneath the rhetoric of purity and strength, lay one of the most sinister chapters in the history of disability, the T4 program, a state-sponsored euthanasia operation that specifically targeted children and adults with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. It began quietly. Letters were sent to German families, asking them to bring their disabled children to special clinics for better treatment, education, and care. Parents, hopeful and desperate, believed they were doing what was best. But once the children arrived, they were never seen again. The T4 program was named after the address of its headquarters, Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin, and its mission was terrifyingly clear: eliminate lives deemed unworthy. Doctors, nurses, and bureaucrats collaborated to carry out mass murders of the disabled. This was not done in secret. It was done with medical forms, signed approvals, and official stamps. Systematic, efficient, sanitized. Children with Down syndrome were among the first victims. They were often the youngest, the most visibly different, and the most vulnerable. Some were killed within days of arrival. Others were kept for observation, studied like specimens, and then euthanized. Their families were sent falsified death certificates, causes of death carefully altered to avoid suspicion. The deception was as cruel as the act itself. By the time public outcry forced the official end of the T4 program in 1941, over 70,000 people had been murdered. But the killing didn't truly stop. It continued in smaller, less visible forms throughout the remainder of the war. This was not war in the traditional sense. These victims were not soldiers. They were not political enemies. They were children in cribs, teenagers with bright smiles, adults who loved music or colours or stories. They were people with Down syndrome, whose lives were deemed too inconvenient, too costly, or too different to protect. The legacy of T4 casts a long shadow. It showed the world just how dangerous it is when society forgets the dignity of every human life. It wasn't just a Nazi crime. It was a human crime, one enabled by silence, stigma, and the belief that some lives matter more than others. But out of that darkness, something began to stir, an awakening. The world, horrified by what had happened, began to ask deeper questions about inclusion, ethics, and the meaning of care. It would be a long road to healing, but the reckoning had begun. In the aftermath of World War II, as the world reckoned with the unimaginable horrors of the Holocaust, something began to change. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The global community had seen, in stark and brutal terms, what happened when entire groups of people were devalued, dehumanized, and discarded. And while this reckoning initially focused on race and religion, it soon extended to people with disabilities, including those with Down syndrome. The moral shock of the T4 program ignited a movement. Parents who had once been told to give up their children, who had been pressured to institutionalize or stay silent, began to speak out. They were no longer willing to accept a life of confinement and shame for their children. They began to organize, first in small community groups, then in national organizations. In the United States, the 1950s and 60s saw the birth of advocacy movements, like the National Association for Retarded Children, now the ARC, which gave families a platform to demand dignity and rights. These early advocates were not politicians or celebrities. They were mothers and fathers. They were people who loved their children deeply and refused to believe that a diagnosis like Down syndrome meant a life without value or purpose. They began to challenge outdated laws, push for better medical care, and demand access to public education, which at the time was denied to most children with intellectual disabilities. The civil rights era provided momentum. As marginalized groups across America fought for equality, disability advocates began to connect their cause to the broader movement for justice. The idea that every person, regardless of race, gender, or ability, deserved equal treatment under the law became a rallying cry. Across the ocean, similar movements emerged. In the UK, Scandinavia, and Australia, parents formed support networks and began to lobby governments. Advocates started publishing newsletters, holding conferences, and creating training programs for teachers and caregivers. A sense of solidarity began to form, not just among parents, but among self-advocates, individuals with Down syndrome who began to speak for themselves. This shift was monumental. It moved people with Down syndrome out of the shadows and into the public conversation. And while progress was far from perfect, a powerful truth had been planted. They had voices, they had potential, and they would no longer be silent. The age of advocacy had begun. As the advocacy movement grew in the 1960s and 70s, something remarkable happened. The people at the heart of the story, individuals with Down syndrome themselves, began to speak. Not just through their families or support organizations, but in their own words, their own actions, and their own lives. This was the decade when silence truly began to break. In many countries, new legislation started to open the doors of public schools to children with intellectual disabilities. In the United States, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975 guaranteed the right to a free and appropriate public education for every child, including those with Down syndrome. This marked a seismic shift. Children who were once kept out of classrooms were now being welcomed in, often for the first time in history. With education came visibility. Children with Down syndrome were no longer hidden away. They were learning alongside their peers, making friends, participating in school plays, attending dances, and building confidence. Teachers, many of whom had never worked with a child with an intellectual disability before, discovered something unexpected. These students had so much to offer. They were capable of learning, growing, and contributing, not just to the classroom, but to the school community as a whole. This visibility extended beyond the classroom. As social norms evolved, people with Down syndrome began to appear in magazines, on television, and eventually in film. In the UK, a groundbreaking documentary aired in 1979 called A World Apart, which followed the life of a young woman with Down syndrome. It was raw, honest, and deeply humanizing. For many viewers, it was the first time they had seen someone with the condition portrayed with dignity and depth. Families, too, continued to share their stories. Personal essays, memoirs, and photo essays began to circulate, showing everyday moments of joy, frustration, growth, and love. These stories didn't sugarcoat the challenges, but they shattered the myth that life with Down syndrome was only sorrow or struggle. And most importantly, self-advocates began to rise. Young adults with Down syndrome started giving speeches, attending conferences, and sharing their experiences. Their message was simple but powerful. We are not less, we are different, and we have something to say. This chapter in history marks the birth of visibility, when the world was finally forced to look, to listen, and to begin seeing people with Down syndrome not as cases, but as human beings. By the 1980s and 1990s, the growing chorus of advocacy, education, and self-expression began to reshape not only public policy, but public perception. A new understanding of Down syndrome was taking root, one that viewed individuals not as problems to manage, but as people to include, support, and celebrate. This shift was driven by several forces coming together at once. Medical advancements were improving health outcomes. Educational reforms were increasing inclusion. And most importantly, a generation of children with Down syndrome, who had been born into a world of advocacy instead of silence, were growing up in full view of society. Medical care played a key role in this transformation. Pediatricians began receiving better training on developmental disabilities. Heart surgeries, once considered too risky or unavailable for children with Down syndrome, became more routine, dramatically improving survival rates. Therapies like speech, occupational, and physical therapy were being offered earlier and more consistently, helping children develop skills that were once considered unreachable. As a result, life expectancy began to climb. In the 1960s, many children with Down syndrome were not expected to live beyond their teens. But by the 1990s, that number had risen dramatically, reaching into the 50s and 60s, with some individuals living well into old age. For the first time in history, people with Down syndrome were not just surviving childhood, they were becoming adults with full lives ahead of them. This new reality forced society to ask deeper questions. What kind of adulthood would they have? Could they work? Could they live independently? Could they marry? The answers, increasingly, were yes. Supported employment programs began connecting adults with Down syndrome to meaningful jobs in grocery stores, offices, hotels, and even businesses started by self-advocates themselves. Housing cooperatives and group homes allowed for semi-independent living. And across the world, stories began to emerge of romantic relationships, marriages, and deep friendships formed between people who, just decades earlier, might never have had the chance to meet one another, let alone dream of a future. It was becoming clear. People with Down syndrome were not defined by their condition. They were individuals, with strengths, struggles, personalities, and dreams. And the world, slowly but surely, was learning how to make room for them. By the early 2000s, something truly beautiful was happening. Individuals with Down syndrome, once hidden away in institutions or quietly raised at home, were stepping into the spotlight, not for pity, not for tokenism, but for the same reasons anyone steps forward, to be seen, heard, and recognized for who they are. Representation was no longer limited to medical journals or advocacy newsletters. People with Down syndrome were appearing in commercials, modeling campaigns, television shows, and even on stage. For the first time, audiences around the world were seeing the joyful, complex, and deeply human reality of living with Down syndrome through the voices and stories of those who lived it. In 2009, a young woman named Madeline Stewart from Australia made global headlines when she became one of the first professional models with Down syndrome. Her photographs weren't just beautiful. They challenged fashion's long-standing standards of beauty. Madeline walked runways in New York, Paris, and London, inspiring thousands and shifting what was considered normal in the modeling world. In Spain, Pablo Pineda became the first person with Down syndrome in Europe to earn a university degree. He didn't just succeed academically. He became an educator, public speaker, and ambassador for inclusion. His visibility helped dispel one of the oldest myths surrounding the condition, the belief that people with Down syndrome could not think deeply, study, or contribute intellectually. Television shows began featuring characters played by actors with Down syndrome, not as side notes, but as fully developed roles. In the US, Lauren Potter starred in the hit series Glee, bringing visibility and confidence to a new generation of viewers. Her advocacy, both on and off screen, helped normalize what had once been misunderstood. But this wasn't just about fame. It was about everyday visibility. People with Down syndrome working in bakeries, greeting customers at hotels, living in apartments, and celebrating birthdays with their communities. It was about classmates, co-workers, neighbors, and friends. Representation mattered because it gave people with Down syndrome a mirror, a way to see themselves in the world. And it gave the rest of society a window into their world, one filled with humor, love, ambition, and individuality. From hidden to seen, from misunderstood to embraced. This was the power of presence, and the world was watching, finally, with open eyes. Despite all the progress, In medicine, advocacy, and visibility, the journey toward full inclusion for people with Down syndrome is far from over. Today, we live in a world of both celebration and contradiction. While many societies have taken meaningful steps forward, others still struggle to accept, support, or even recognize the value of lives that don't fit into conventional expectations. One of the most sensitive and complex issues is prenatal screening. With advances in genetic testing, many expectant parents around the world now have the option to know, early in pregnancy, whether their child might have Down syndrome. And while information can be empowering, it can also lead to difficult decisions, especially in cultures where disability is still feared or misunderstood. In some countries, particularly in parts of Europe and Asia, termination rates following a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome are alarmingly high, reaching over 90% in some regions. This raises deeply emotional questions. Are these choices truly free, or are they shaped by societal pressure, lack of support, and fear of the unknown? Many parents have shared that they were given the diagnosis in cold clinical terms, with a long list of risks, but little mention of joy, growth, or possibility. Few were introduced to families raising happy, thriving children with Down syndrome. Fewer still were told about the growing community of adults living fulfilling, independent lives. In this silence, fear grows. The issue isn't about judgment, it's about understanding. The truth is, many societies still haven't made space for people with Down syndrome to be fully included in education, employment, housing, or relationships. Too often, parents are left to navigate these systems alone, and children are still met with lowered expectations, limited access, or subtle exclusion. There's also the challenge of tokenism. Representation is growing, but sometimes it's treated as novelty instead of normalcy. A few success stories are celebrated loudly, while many still live on the margins, unseen. And yet, in the face of these challenges, the movement continues. Advocates, including people with Down syndrome themselves, are pushing for better policies, deeper inclusion, and a cultural shift toward true acceptance. Because the ultimate goal isn't just awareness, it's belonging. A world where no one with Down syndrome is seen as a mistake, but as a life worth living, loving, and lifting up. When we look back across the centuries, at the silence, the stigma, the rejection, and the resistance, one truth rises above all the noise. Every life has meaning. This isn't just a belief. It's a fact that history, time and again, has quietly tried to prove, even when society refused to see it. People with Down syndrome have always been part of the human family, from ancient burial sites to medieval villages, from the cold halls of 19th century institutions to the red carpets of the 21st century. They have been here, living, laughing, struggling, surviving, teaching. What they have offered the world isn't always loud or glamorous. It's quieter, but no less powerful. Their lives often radiate gentleness, honesty, and emotional intelligence. Many who live or work with individuals with Down syndrome speak of a rare kind of sincerity, a disarming warmth that can shift an entire room. Not because they're inspirational, but because they are present, real, and deeply human. We must resist the temptation to romanticize or flatten their experiences. A person with Down syndrome, like anyone else, is complex, capable of joy, frustration, ambition, sadness, and love. Their lives are not without challenge, but they are not defined by limitation. They are not symbols of purity or tragedy. They are individuals, with their own voices, stories, and agency. And their presence in this world reminds us of something vital. Humanity is not measured by IQ, productivity, or perfection. It is measured by connection, by kindness, by the capacity to love and be loved. When we say that every life has meaning, we're not offering charity. We're stating a universal truth, one that applies to us all. Because if a person needs to prove their worth to deserve life, none of us are safe. But if we start from the belief that worth is inherent, that every person matters just because they are, then we begin to build a world where everyone truly belongs. People with Down syndrome don't need our pity. They need our presence, our partnership, our willingness to listen, adapt, and make space. Their lives are not side notes in history. They are chapters in the human story, and some of the most beautiful ones at that. So, how were people with Down syndrome treated throughout history? The honest answer is layered and complex. A story of sorrow and silence, but also of resilience, revolution, and love. For much of recorded history, they lived in the shadows, misunderstood in ancient myths, hidden away during the medieval period, and objectified under the cold gaze of early medicine. At times, they were feared. At times, forgotten. And in the darkest moments, like during the eugenics movement and Nazi Germany, they were targeted simply for existing. Yet they endured, not just as victims of history, but as active participants in it, through the families who fought for them, the teachers who believed in them, and eventually through their own voices rising to say, "We are here. We matter." The story of people with Down syndrome is not just a medical or social history, it's a human one. It reflects how we, as a society, define dignity, who we protect, who we prioritize, and what we believe makes a life valuable. In recent decades, we've seen a transformation that would have once seemed unimaginable. People with Down syndrome graduating from schools, working jobs, acting in films, falling in love, advocating for their rights, and shaping their communities. From exclusion to celebration, the arc of this journey speaks not only to their strength, but to our collective potential to evolve. But this progress did not happen by accident. It came from love, fierce, stubborn, and persistent love. From parents who refused to accept silence. From doctors who chose empathy over protocol. From educators who saw ability where others saw deficit. And from people with Down syndrome themselves, who lived authentically in a world that often underestimated them. That legacy of courage, presence, and perseverance is still being written today. As we close this journey through history, may we carry forward the lessons it offers, to question inherited prejudice, to uplift the unheard, and to recognize that the value of a person is never up for debate. People with Down syndrome are not anomalies in the human story. They are threads in its very fabric, woven with grace, endurance, and the quiet power of being fully, unapologetically alive. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, consider liking the video and subscribing for more human-centered history. And tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? I'd love to know who's with us tonight. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and take care. Long before the invention of writing, before kingdoms were carved into stone or temples rose under the sun, humans felt the urge to adorn themselves. Jewelry, in its raw, primal form, may be one of the oldest expressions of human identity. It began not with gold or diamonds, but with what nature offered. Shells, bones, teeth, stones, feathers. The oldest known pieces of jewelry were discovered in a cave in Morocco. 33 perforated Nassarius shells believed to be over 100,000 years old. Threaded together as beads, they were likely worn as necklaces or anklets. They may seem simple to our modern eyes, but these were revolutionary artifacts. They signaled a leap in symbolic thinking, the ability to represent status, group affiliation, or spiritual belief through objects worn on the body. In prehistoric cultures, jewelry was not made for vanity. It was communication. A necklace of animal teeth might suggest a hunter's prowess. A string of shells could symbolize fertility, trade, or kinship. In many early burial sites across Europe and Africa, skeletons are found with ornaments placed carefully around the neck, wrists, and ankles. Evidence that jewelry played a role in rituals of death and remembrance, guiding souls into the afterlife, or marking them as members of a sacred lineage. Even among nomadic and tribal communities, where survival was the primary concern, Time was devoted to crafting adornments. Pieces were shaped, polished, engraved. Pigments were applied. These acts show us that jewellery wasn't frivolous. It was central to the human experience, a way to carry meaning, memory, and magic. What's especially fascinating is that this early jewellery emerged independently in different parts of the world. From Siberian mammoth ivory bracelets to African ostrich shell beads, cultures separated by oceans and language all turned to ornamentation. Why? Because jewellery satisfies something universal: the need to belong, the need to express, the need to transform the body into something more than just flesh and bone. Long before precious metals and royal crowns, jewellery was deeply human, a silent language of identity, protection, beauty, and belief. It was our first sparkle, and from that first glint of a bead strung through twine, an entire world of adornment was born. As early human societies evolved into great civilizations, so too did the art of jewellery. In the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, gold became not just a metal, but a language of power and prestige. Artisans of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon crafted intricate pieces from gold, silver, and precious stones like carnelian, lapis lazuli, and agate. Jewellery adorned not just the living, but the statues of gods, as offerings in temples glistening with sacred light. Mesopotamian jewellery was deeply symbolic. Spiral motifs represented eternal life, while geometric patterns spoke of cosmic order. Women of high status wore elaborate headdresses, bracelets, and pendants, often buried with them to ensure continuity in the afterlife. These items weren't mere accessories. They were extensions of divine favour, political power, and cultural sophistication. Meanwhile, in the rich, sun-drenched land of Egypt, jewellery reached an even deeper spiritual resonance. Gold, abundant in Nubia and treasured by the Egyptians, was considered the flesh of the gods, incorruptible, eternal, and sacred. Every piece worn by a pharaoh or priestess was crafted with purpose, to protect, to invoke, to transform. Amulets held immense importance. The scarab beetle symbolized regeneration and rebirth. The ankh, shaped like a cross with a loop, represented life eternal. The Eye of Horus, worn close to the heart or forehead, was believed to ward off evil and ensure health and restoration. These talismans were inlaid with vibrant stones: turquoise, lapis, garnet, each selected not just for beauty, but for its energetic and spiritual properties. Jewellery also reflected social status. Gold collars, broad pectorals, and inlaid rings told stories of wealth, lineage, and divine association. Children wore protective charms. Animals were sometimes adorned with collars bearing inscriptions. Even the dead were wrapped in layers of symbolic jewellery, from toe caps to headdresses, ensuring their safe journey into the next world. In both Mesopotamia and Egypt, jewellery wasn't an afterthought. It was woven into the fabric of religion, governance, and personal identity. It marked the wearer as chosen, by gods, by kings, or by fate itself. This era set the stage for what jewellery would continue to be: a shimmering extension of the soul, a coded language of beauty, power, and protection, forged in fire, polished by belief. As civilization blossomed around the Mediterranean, jewellery evolved into an art form that married personal beauty with civic identity. In ancient Greece and Rome, adornments were not only reflections of wealth, but declarations of taste, philosophy, and even patriotism. The Greeks believed in harmony, not just in architecture and sculpture, but in the human form itself. Jewellery was designed to complement the body, enhancing natural elegance rather than overpowering it. Gold wreaths shaped like olive branches adorned the heads of both gods and mortals. Earrings and bracelets featured detailed repoussé work, often depicting mythological scenes: Athena with her owl, Aphrodite rising from the sea, or Eros, the god of desire, clutching an arrow. Gemstones became more prominent, but they were prized not only for colour, also for meaning. Carnelian was believed to calm anger. Amethyst protected against intoxication. Engraved gems, called intaglios, were used as personal seals, pressed into wax to sign documents. These pieces held not just beauty, but identity and authority. In Rome, jewelry became even more widespread and opulent. With the expansion of the empire came access to exotic materials, pearls from the Persian Gulf, emeralds from Egypt, sapphires from Sri Lanka. Roman women, especially of the upper class, wore layers of adornment, from elaborate fibulae, brooches, that held their garments together to rings on nearly every finger. Men, though more restrained, still wore signet rings and amulets, often inscribed with protective symbols or family crests. Jewelry in Rome also crossed the lines of class. Freed slaves, once given citizenship, would wear gold rings as a mark of their new status. Soldiers returning from conquest often bore spoils of war in the form of jewelry, not just for personal use, but as offerings to the gods. But it wasn't all vanity. Many items were worn for protection. The bulla, a locket worn by Roman children, held amulets to guard them from evil spirits. Even emperors believed in the power of charms. Tiny figures of Hercules, serpents, and phallic symbols were worn under togas, hidden but believed to be potent. For the Greeks and Romans, jewelry was more than accessory. It was biography. Each piece told a story, of lineage, of virtue, of belief. It announced who you were, what you valued, and sometimes who you prayed would protect you. While the Mediterranean world shaped jewelry through aesthetics and empire, the East, particularly India, forged a path where adornment became inseparable from spirituality, ritual, and the rhythms of life itself. In India, jewelry was not merely decorative. It was sacred. It was symbolic. It was, and still is, part of the soul's language. From the Indus Valley civilization around 2500 BCE, archaeologists have uncovered beautifully detailed bangles, nose rings, and bead necklaces crafted from carnelian, gold, and faience. Even then, Indian artisans showed extraordinary skill and an intuitive sense that jewelry was not just worn, it was lived in. Unlike the West, where jewelry often indicated wealth alone, in India, it served as a kind of visual scripture, telling stories of love, fertility, protection, and divinity. Gold was, and remains, the most revered material. It's associated with Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity, and considered pure, auspicious, and eternal. Women often receive gold jewelry at birth, during marriage, and as part of inheritance, not just as gifts, but as security, spiritual armor, and a symbol of their worth. Each part of the body had its own sacred ornament. Mangtika for the forehead, believed to stimulate the sixth chakra. Jhumkas for the ears, anklets that sang with every step, and toe rings that symbolized marital status. Bangles worn in pairs were said to bring harmony to a woman's energy, while nose rings linked her to sensuality and strength. But Indian jewelry wasn't limited to women. Kings wore gem-studded turbans, jeweled armlets, and rings that carried the weight of dynasties. Warriors went into battle with talismans tied around their necks or wrists, pieces blessed by priests to bring courage or ward off death. In other parts of the East, such as China and Southeast Asia, jade became the stone of immortality. It was more prized than gold, believed to preserve the spirit and harmonize the body. Dragons, phoenixes, and lotus flowers were carved into pendants worn from birth until death, and often buried with the wearer to guide them into the next world. Across the East, jewelry was, and remains, a form of prayer, power, and poetry. It speaks without words, protects without swords, and decorates not just the body, but the journey of life itself. In medieval Europe, jewelry took on new forms and new meanings, shaped by a world torn between the splendor of royalty and the solemnity of religion. This was a time when crowns were considered divine symbols, when rings sealed fates and alliances, and when even the humblest pendant could carry the weight of a prayer. As Christianity spread across Europe, jewellery evolved from pagan amulets to sacred symbols of faith. Crosses became common pendants, worn to protect and to proclaim devotion. Relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of holy cloth, even drops of what was believed to be Christ's blood, were encased in ornate reliquaries and worn close to the heart. These were not just objects of beauty, they were considered spiritually charged, capable of healing or intercession. Monasteries and churches commissioned goldsmiths to craft elaborate chalices, bishops' rings, and rosary beads strung with pearls or jet. Every piece served a function: to inspire awe, demonstrate piety, or signify authority. Jewellery was no longer just personal, it had become political and theological. In royal courts, jewellery was a statement of lineage and legitimacy. Crowns, sceptres, and brooches were embedded with sapphires, rubies, and emeralds, not just for beauty, but for symbolism. Sapphire stood for wisdom and divine favour, ruby for courage and passion, emerald for fertility and rebirth. Kings and queens used these gems like language, crafting a message with every stone. Feudal lords exchanged rings to seal oaths of loyalty. Knights were given jewelled tokens, sometimes a lady's brooch or a locket, to carry into battle, worn over armour as both a charm and a symbol of their cause. Rings of mourning, too, became common, engraved with names and dates, worn in memory of lost loved ones, their sentiments sealed in gold. Among the rising merchant class, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what. Jewellery became a visible boundary between classes, pearls for the elite, base metals for commoners. But even among peasants, simple adornments persisted: a copper ring, a braided cord with a carved bone charm. They might not shine like a royal ruby, but they carried just as much meaning to the wearer. In the medieval world, jewellery was no longer just about wealth or beauty. It had become a vessel of belief, a tool of allegiance, and a bridge between the earthly and the divine. As Europe emerged from the shadows of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance swept across the continent like a rebirth of light. In this era of rediscovery, of science, art, and individualism, jewellery was elevated to an entirely new plane. No longer just symbolic or devotional, it became a statement of intellectual sophistication, artistic patronage, and personal elegance. The wealthy elite, nobles, merchants, and rising dynasties began to commission custom-made jewellery from master goldsmiths. These artisans, inspired by classical antiquity, fused techniques from ancient Rome and Greece with the innovations of the day. Enamelling flourished. Coloured gemstones were arranged in elaborate, symmetrical designs. Goldsmiths became artists in their own right, working in collaboration with painters, poets, and architects. Portraits from the 15th and 16th centuries show nobility adorned in delicate chains, jewelled hairnets, and neck pieces set with rubies, sapphires, and pearls. Jewellery wasn't merely decorative, it was a coded language. A locket could contain a lover's portrait or a lock of hair. A brooch might feature allegorical figures: Cupid for love, the phoenix for rebirth, or the Ouroboros, a serpent eating its own tail, to symbolize eternity. Religious jewellery still had a place, but it became more personal, less institutional. Tiny devotional pendants, etched with saints or biblical scenes, were hidden inside elaborate designs. Rosaries were strung with gold and coral beads, carried as much for status as for prayer. The Renaissance also saw the emergence of the gemstone as more than a symbol. It became a centerpiece. Cutting techniques improved, and gem merchants travelled far and wide to acquire diamonds from India, emeralds from Colombia, and pearls from the Persian Gulf. These stones weren't just worn. They were marvelled at, written about, and even passed through courts as diplomatic gifts. Women's jewellery was layered and opulent: girdles hung with trinkets, earrings with dangling pearls, collars thick with gems. Men wore chains of office, jewelled rings, and ornamented sword hilts. Jewellery became a wearable canvas, a blend of identity, aspiration, and artistry. In the Renaissance, beauty was divine, and jewellery, worn close to the body, became a way to express that divinity in gold, stone, and form, not as a whisper of status, but as a radiant, undeniable declaration of self. As the Renaissance gave way to the Baroque era, jewellery transformed once again, this time into a theatrical display of opulence, wealth, and global reach. From the 17th to the early 18th century, adornment became more dramatic, more extravagant, and more politically charged. Jewellery was no longer just a matter of taste. It was a proclamation of dominance, both personal and imperial. The courts of Europe, especially those of Louis XIV in France and the Habsburgs in Spain and Austria, embraced adornment as a performance. Necklines plunged, collars rose, and every exposed surface became an opportunity for decoration. Women wore bodices covered in gemstone clusters, while men draped themselves in heavy gold chains and gemstone-studded insignia. Hairpins, shoe buckles, gloves, and even fans were encrusted with precious stones. What fueled this explosion of glitter was more than just art. It was conquest. European powers were now expanding across the globe. The riches of India, Africa, and the Americas flooded into royal treasuries. Diamonds from Golconda, emeralds from Colombia, and gold mined by colonized labor became the raw material for European luxury. Jewelry became a display of colonial power, the sparkling reward of imperial ambition. One iconic example is the famed La Peregrina pearl. Discovered off the coast of Panama in the 16th century, it passed through the hands of Spanish royalty, Napoleon's brother, and eventually Hollywood icon Elizabeth Taylor. But behind its beauty lay centuries of conquest, labor, and cultural exchange. Baroque jewelry was not subtle. Brooches grew large and ornate, rings became miniature sculptures, and earrings often reached the shoulders. The scrolls, ribbons, and floral motifs of the period reflected the architecture and music of the time, ornate, layered, and bursting with emotion. Religious jewelry, too, reached new levels of complexity. Rosaries were set with diamonds. Reliquaries were made portable, worn as lockets filled with saints' bones and adorned with angels, doves, and golden thorns. Jewelry became both armor and altar. Yet beneath the shimmer, a new world order was forming. Trade, colonization, and the rise of the merchant class began to shift who could access luxury, and who could no longer be ignored. The Baroque period wasn't just about showing off. It was about controlling the narrative, in gold, in gemstones, and in spectacle. Jewelry told the story of who ruled the world and who paid the price for it. The 18th and 19th centuries were marked by upheaval. Revolutions toppled monarchies, the middle class gained power, and the Industrial Revolution reshaped how the world worked, dressed, and adorned itself. Jewelry, once the exclusive language of royalty and the church, began to evolve, becoming more democratic, more personal, and surprisingly, more romantic. In the wake of the French Revolution, ostentatious jewelry fell out of favor. Lavish displays of wealth could be dangerous. Simpler, neoclassical styles took hold, inspired by ancient Rome and Greece. A subtle nod to ideals of reason, equality, and restrained elegance. Think delicate cameos, laurel wreath motifs, and lockets worn under the collar close to the heart. But with the Victorian era came a different kind of extravagance, one not rooted in monarchy, but in sentiment. Queen Victoria of England set the tone for much of 19th century jewellery. Her love story with Prince Albert was immortalised in matching bracelets, mourning brooches, and lockets of hair. Jewellery became deeply emotional, an extension of love, grief, and memory. Engagement rings grew in popularity. So did birthstone jewellery and charm bracelets, each piece a fragment of one's personal story. Advancements in technology made jewellery more accessible. Mass production, electroplating, and machine-cut stones allowed the middle class to participate in trends once reserved for nobility. Costume jewellery emerged, not fake, but fashionable, allowing people to express themselves affordably and often. Meanwhile, global influence continued to expand. Japanese motifs entered Western design during the Art Nouveau movement. Persian and Mughal designs inspired the flowing, gem-drenched styles of elite ateliers. With colonization came both exploitation and cultural fusion, seen in the gemstones and aesthetics worn from Paris to New York. By the late 19th century, jewellery houses like Tiffany and Hermès and Cartier were rising to prominence. These weren't just stores, they were brands that would help define luxury for the new century. Their designs blended elegance with identity, offering pieces that felt timeless yet modern, refined yet emotional. Jewellery in this era became more than status. It became wearable biography, celebrating births, mourning deaths, symbolising unions, and even marking independence. And just on the horizon, a revolution in style and design was approaching, one that would change the face of jewellery forever. The 20th century shattered traditions and redrew boundaries, in politics, in art, and most certainly in jewellery. From the Art Deco movement to street fashion, from the glittering red carpet to hand-woven tribal beads, jewellery became more than ornamentation. It became self-expression, a statement not just of status, but of identity, resistance, and reinvention. The early 1900s ushered in the bold geometry of Art Deco. Inspired by industrial design, Egyptian archaeology, and Jazz-Age glamour, this style celebrated clean lines, symmetry, and contrast. Platinum, onyx, and diamonds were favourites. Women wore long, linear earrings and flapper-style necklaces. Men adorned themselves with cufflinks and tie bars. It was a celebration of modernity, jewellery for a world speeding into the future. World wars temporarily shifted fashion toward restraint, but post-war prosperity reignited sparkle. In the 1950s, Hollywood shaped jewellery trends. Stars like Marilyn Monroe and Audrey Hepburn made diamonds and pearls synonymous with elegance. Meanwhile, houses like Cartier, Van Cleef & Arpels, and Harry Winston became symbols of global luxury, merging royalty with celebrity. By the 1960s and 70s, jewellery began to reflect rebellion. The counterculture movement embraced handmade, spiritual, and nature-inspired pieces. Beads, leather, and turquoise became signatures of the free spirit. In contrast, the disco era of the 80s brought maximalism back. Gold chains, oversized earrings, and bold gemstones mirrored a decade of ambition and excess. Then came identity jewellery, pieces worn to say, "This is who I am." Pride pins, nameplate necklaces, zodiac pendants, political brooches. Jewellery became a canvas for culture, belief, gender, and belonging. It told the world where you stood, who you loved, or what you survived. In recent years, the conversation around jewellery has expanded to include sustainability, ethics, and story. Lab-grown diamonds challenge old definitions of value. Heirloom redesigns give new life to family history. Artisan revival movements celebrate indigenous craftsmanship and community over mass production, and digital culture plays its part. A piece of jewellery today might trend on Instagram, be handcrafted by a local maker, or symbolise a cause close to the heart. No longer confined to gold or diamonds, jewellery is now as diverse as the people who wear it. It's not just about shine, it's about meaning. From Mesopotamian amulets to digital-era signet rings, jewellery has always spoken. And as long as humans long to express who they are, it always will. On the shimmering coastline of southern Italy, not far from the chaos of modern Naples, there lies a place that once rivaled the grandeur of Rome itself, Baia. Today, it's quiet, partially submerged, and largely forgotten by time. But beneath its tranquil waters and weathered ruins, something extraordinary lingers. A chamber lost to the sea, carved deep into volcanic rock, shrouded in steam and legend. They call it the Oracle Tomb, and some whisper it may be a literal gateway to the underworld. To the ancients, Baia wasn't just a city. It was a sanctuary of pleasure and prophecy, vice and vision. It rested on the restless earth of the Campi Flegrei, the burning fields, a vast volcanic caldera where the ground shifts, breathes and smoulders. Gases hiss from cracks in the earth. Waters bubble unnaturally. It's a place where the physical world feels thin, as if something else lies just beneath it. For centuries, Baia served as a playground for emperors, generals and poets. Lavish villas hugged the cliffs. Statues of gods and heroes overlooked private ports. But as the land sank and the sea rose, much of the city slipped underwater. The marble promenades and mosaic floors now lie beneath waves, preserved in silence, untouched by air, watched only by fish and the occasional diver. And yet, amid these submerged wonders, one chamber stands apart. Partially underwater, hidden near the ruins of an ancient bath complex, it descends into darkness. It is no ordinary ruin. It was carved with intention, layered with symbolism, and aligned with something beyond architecture, something sacred or forbidden. To step into it today is to step into a different reality, one where myth might still breathe in the stones. Modern archaeologists gave it a name, the Oracle Tomb, but older voices called it something else, the Antrum, the Cavern, a place where the veil between the living and the dead wore thin, where prophecy could be drawn from vapours, and where those brave enough could descend not just into earth, but into the very imagination of ancient Rome. Whatever lies within, it does not rest quietly. The Oracle Tomb is waiting, and its story begins where the land vanishes beneath the sea. Baia was no ordinary Roman settlement. It was the empire's escape hatch, a retreat for emperors, aristocrats, and the privileged elite, built not for governance or warfare, but for indulgence. Nestled along the Bay of Naples, Baia glimmered with luxury, a city soaked in pleasure and veiled in scandal. To walk its marble streets was to brush shoulders with power. To bathe in its thermal springs was to immerse yourself in the rituals of both healing and hedonism. The city's fame was not merely due to its wealth, but its landscape, built atop a restless volcano. Baia rose directly over the Campi Flegrei, a massive supervolcano whose energy heated the ground, bubbled its waters, and lent the air a strange, metallic scent. The Romans called this region the breathing place of the gods. Here, the earth itself seemed alive, shifting, exhaling sulfur, and whispering secrets through steam. It was here that Roman engineers and artists constructed magnificent bathhouses, domed pavilions, and private palaces that rivaled anything in the capital. Nero had a villa here. So did Julius Caesar, and later, Hadrian. These weren't just places of rest. They were scenes of politics, affairs, and decadence. It was said that what happened in Baia never left Baia. The city became so synonymous with excess that poets and moralists openly condemned it. Seneca the Younger called it a vortex of luxury. But Baia's geological beauty was its undoing. Over time, the volcanic activity that warmed its baths and inspired its mystique began to shift the land beneath it. A process known as bradyseism, the rising and falling of the earth due to volcanic gas movement, caused entire sections of the city to slowly sink. By the late Roman period, the sea had claimed Baia's lower levels. Temples, gardens, and mosaic-covered floors now lie beneath shallow, glimmering waters, a surreal underwater museum. Divers today swim past marble columns and forgotten sculptures. What was once the seat of sensual pleasure is now eerily still, preserved by the sea like a sleeping ghost of empire. And it is here, among these sunken ruins and steaming fissures, that one structure remained hidden for centuries, a chamber untouched by time, carved into myth, and said to be the entrance to the underworld itself. The Oracle Tomb of Baia remained lost for nearly 2,000 years, buried beneath volcanic soil, shrouded by myth, and ultimately forgotten. That is, until the mid-20th century, when a quiet yet extraordinary discovery was made by a man who wasn't a famous archaeologist or a headline-seeking treasure hunter, but a British amateur explorer and civil engineer named Robert Paget. In the 1960s, Paget, along with his colleague Keith Jones and a small team of volunteers, began excavating a mysterious site near the ancient baths of Baia. Guided by ancient texts, geological surveys, and a sense that there was more beneath the surface than anyone realized, they uncovered a narrow, stone-lined passage that descended deep into the hillside. The tunnel seemed unremarkable at first. Just another example of Roman engineering. But as they pressed deeper, they began to notice strange features, deliberately carved bends, sudden drops in temperature, rising humidity, and finally, a steeply descending passage flanked by benches carved into the rock. This was no aqueduct. It was ritualistic. The deeper they went, the more it resembled something sacred or forbidden. Their excavation revealed a carefully engineered journey downward, culminating in a chamber partially submerged in water. Sulphurous steam rose from the black pool. The air was thick, the visibility low. And there, in the darkness, was a sense of disquiet, as if the ancient stone itself remembered. Paget was convinced. They had found the legendary antrum, the sacred cave described by ancient Roman writers, believed to be the domain of the Cumaean Sibyl, the prophetic priestess of Apollo. This was no tomb in the traditional sense. It was a portal, a constructed descent into the underworld, where rituals of prophecy, initiation, and perhaps even necromancy had once taken place. The layout aligned eerily with classical accounts. Virgil, in his Aeneid, wrote of Aeneas descending into Hades near Lake Avernus, just miles from Baia. The Sibyl, he said, led him through a stifling cave of shadows and fumes. Now, Paget and his team had seemingly walked the same path. Though his findings were largely ignored by mainstream academia at the time, the Oracle Tomb of Baia remained one of the most haunting archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, not for what it proved, but for what it suggested, that mythology, in rare moments, might leave behind a physical trail. To truly grasp the mystery of the Oracle Tomb, one must return to the world of Roman myth, to the stories whispered by poets, preserved by scribes, and feared by pilgrims. In this landscape of gods and shadows, one figure looms above all others in connection with the underworld, the Cumaean Sibyl. According to legend, the Sibyl was a priestess of Apollo who lived near Lake Avernus, a volcanic crater lake just a short distance from Baia. The Romans believed this lake was the actual entrance to Hades, the land of the dead. Fumes from the earth rose steadily from its banks, and birds were said to fall dead from the sky as they flew over its cursed surface. It was the perfect setting for a seer who claimed to speak on behalf of the gods and the spirits beyond. The Sibyl's prophecies were cryptic, often terrifying. She was said to enter trance-like states, intoxicated by volcanic vapours, her voice echoing through a sacred tunnel, a cave that descended into the earth. For centuries, scholars speculated where this legendary oracle once stood. Paget's discovery in Baia offered a compelling answer. The structure he uncovered mirrors the descriptions found in classical texts. Virgil, writing in the Aeneid, described a dark passage, hot with the breath of the earth, where the hero Aeneas was led by the Sibyl to commune with the dead. He wrote of choking vapours, of silence broken only by the dripping of unseen water, and of the fearful hush that hung over the entrance to the underworld. The Oracle Tomb of Baia matches this imagery, not just in structure, but in sensation. Those who have entered the narrow passage speak of the oppressive heat, the chemical scent of sulphur, the disorienting darkness. At the tunnel's end, the water-filled chamber reflects any light like obsidian glass. Sound is muted, giving the space a tomb-like stillness. Was this the actual chamber where the Sibyl spoke? Or was it a later Roman attempt to recreate a place of myth? Either way, it serves a chilling purpose. It materializes the metaphysical. It gives form to fear, space to the sacred, a physical descent that mirrors the spiritual one, into the unconscious, into death, into prophecy. The oracle tomb doesn't just resemble the entrance to the underworld, it feels like it. The oracle tomb of Baya is not a structure of chance, it is a calculated experience. Every curve, descent and chamber within its volcanic walls seems designed to lead not just the body, but the soul, through transformation. To walk through it in ancient times was not a simple act of curiosity. It was ritual. It was initiation. It was a descent into mystery, governed by fire, steam, and water, the elemental forces of the Roman underworld. As Robert Paget and his team explored the site in the 1960s, they began to see the tunnel not merely as an architectural marvel, but as a spiritual theatre. The passage began gently, then twisted and narrowed, leading downward into thickening heat and darkness. Carved benches suggested that pilgrims may have paused to meditate or pray. The deeper one travelled, the more the environment changed. The volcanic heat intensified. The walls became slick with condensation. The air grew heavy with sulphur, the very breath of the chthonic world. The journey culminated in a final plunge. A hidden stairway led into a chamber partially submerged in thermal water. The chamber itself was quiet, enclosed, and surreal, a pool that reflected light like ink. In ancient times, torchlight would have danced across the ceiling, illuminating the steam rising from the surface. The effect would have been otherworldly, a sensation of standing between realms, immersed in both the physical and the metaphysical. Paget theorized that this pool may have represented the Styx, the river that, in Roman and Greek myth, separated the living from the dead. The ritual journey through the tunnel would mimic that descent, passing from light to shadow, from life to the threshold of death. Those who entered may have sought prophecy, absolution, or communion with the spirits of their ancestors. And then they would return, slowly, retracing their steps, rising once again toward daylight. But they would not emerge unchanged. The experience would linger like smoke. They had touched the edge of something vast and unknowable. Whether or not they heard the Sibyl's voice, they had entered a realm few dared approach. This wasn't tourism, it was pilgrimage. And the forces that shaped the oracle tomb, fire, earth and water, had also reshaped those who walked its path. The oracle tomb of Baya is not grand in scale, yet it contains a profound architectural genius. What at first glance appears to be a simple volcanic passage reveals itself, layer by layer, to be a masterwork of symbolic construction, designed not for the living world, but for an experience of death and return. The passage is roughly 400 feet long, but its psychological depth far exceeds its physical measurement. Robert Paget and his team were the first to notice that the tunnel was built with specific intention. It was not random, nor strictly utilitarian. The angles, chambers, and orientation suggested an initiation rite, not a public bath or tomb. Its form mimicked myth. The entrance begins innocently, allowing light to filter in. But almost immediately the path bends, sharply, deliberately, removing the line of sight to the outside world. The air grows warmer, the passage narrower. Light fades. Each step becomes an act of trust in the structure, and in whatever forces it was meant to invoke. Roughly halfway through the descent, the tunnel intersects with a vertical shaft, likely designed to carry hot gases upward from underground vents. Paget believed this was no accident. The shaft may have filled the tunnel with sulfuric vapors, enhancing the illusion of descent into another realm. To the ancient mind, these fumes were the very breath of the gods, intoxicating, disorienting, and sacred. From there, the tunnel curves again, leading to a narrow staircase descending into the final chamber, the so-called oracle pool. This room, partially submerged and sealed in darkness, could only be entered by stepping into the water itself. Some scholars believe a hidden priestess or attendant may have spoken from an unseen alcove, delivering prophecies in a trance-like voice, aided by the echo of stone and the distortion of steam. The architecture, in this view, was a kind of spiritual technology. It altered the senses, controlled the journey, and created the illusion, or perhaps the reality, of divine contact. Like the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, this was a space built for transition between worlds. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to transform. The oracle tomb didn't just house rituals, it was the ritual carved into stone. The oracle tomb of Bayer stands at a peculiar crossroads, between archaeology and allegory, between physical ruin and immortal myth. It forces us to ask, where does history end and legend begin? The Cumaean Sibyl, long associated with the nearby cave systems of Cumae, is not just a mythological figure. She was recorded by Roman historians, feared by generals, and immortalized in literature. According to legend, she was granted a 1,000-year lifespan by Apollo, but forgot to ask for eternal youth. Over time, she withered, her voice echoing from deep within the earth, a prophetic whisper from the void. Her presence dominates this region. The Roman poet Virgil placed her at the center of the Aeneid's descent into the underworld. In that tale, the hero Aeneas approaches the Sibyl, who guides him into Hades through a dark passage filled with poisonous vapors and sacred dread. The setting? Near Lake Avernus, just a few miles from the site of Bayer's Oracle Tunnel. Paget's discovery, the dark descent, the sulfur fumes, the final chamber of water, seems to mirror this literary descent too perfectly to ignore. Could this chamber have inspired the myths? Or were the myths so deeply believed that the chamber was built in homage to them? Historians remain divided. Some see the tunnel as a sophisticated Roman ritual space, perhaps built to simulate the mythic journey, a kind of immersive religious theatre for elite initiates. Others believe it may have had a more literal purpose, used by a cult or priesthood to facilitate real oracular experiences, induced by hallucinogenic gases and the powerful psychological effects of the environment itself. There is also the possibility that it was both. For ancient Romans, myth and reality were not separate domains. A temple didn't merely represent a god, it housed one. A cave didn't just resemble the underworld, it was the threshold. The people who walked into this tunnel thousands of years ago likely didn't see it as metaphor. They saw it as entry. And so, the oracle tomb becomes more than a ruin. It is a memory that refuses to fade, a space that preserves the psychic terrain of a civilization that believed powerfully in what lay beneath. When Robert Paget and Keith Jones unveiled their findings in the 1960s, they did not receive the acclaim one might expect for uncovering a possible portal to the underworld. In fact, much of the academic world met their claims with skepticism, if not outright dismissal. Why? Because the oracle tomb didn't fit neatly into traditional categories. It wasn't a temple with inscriptions. It wasn't a tomb filled with artifacts. It lacked the grandeur of Pompeii or the documentation of Rome's civic structures. To many, it was just an odd tunnel carved into a hillside. A curiosity, not a revelation. And yet, the structure's precision defied that label. Its design, temperature shifts, alignment with ancient literary descriptions, and subterranean water chamber pointed to something more than coincidence. Paget's documentation was thorough, and his interpretation, while bold, wasn't without precedent. After all, sacred caves and prophetic passages are found throughout the ancient world, from Delphi to Eleusis. In recent years, a new generation of researchers has returned to Bayer with fresh eyes and advanced technology. Ground-penetrating radar, underwater archaeology, and 3D mapping have begun to reveal the city's sunken secrets, including thermal bath systems, garden courtyards, and submerged mosaics, still intact beneath the waves. The oracle tomb, once ridiculed, is now being reconsidered, not as fantasy, but as a functional space within a culture that lived within myth. Even skeptics must admit, the engineering is deliberate. The environmental manipulation, from heat and darkness to acoustics and vapor, is purposeful. Whether it was built for a literal descent to Hades or to simulate one is now less important than this. It worked. Visitors would have felt changed by the journey. The tunnel shaped their senses. confused their orientation, and altered their state of mind. Whether through ritual, myth, or gas-induced trance, it brought them to the edge of something they couldn't name, and then led them back again. In this sense, the Oracle Tomb mirrors all great spiritual experiences. It doesn't give answers. It poses a question, one etched in silence and stone. Is this myth made real, or reality shaped by myth? Baya's oracle chamber has not spoken in millennia, but even in its silence, it still challenges us to listen differently, to look deeper, and to wonder if the ancient world knew something we have forgotten. Today, the Oracle Tomb of Baya lies mostly forgotten by tourists, overshadowed by the more famous ruins of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Its entrance is modest, unmarked by statues or triumphal arches. The tunnel disappears into the hillside like a secret, quiet, damp, waiting. And yet, those who step inside still describe the same sensation, a subtle tightening of the air, a hush that wraps around the senses like a shroud. Time has weathered its stone, but not its mystery. What makes this site so compelling, so eerily unforgettable, is not just its structure or its setting. It's the feeling it evokes, that we are not merely observing history, but brushing up against something older than history, a doorway into the psychological heart of the ancient world. The Romans, with all their roads and legions, still feared what lay beneath their feet. They built shrines over cave mouths, and made offerings to the dead at the edge of volcanic craters. They named the entrance to the underworld Mundus, and every August they believed the spirits of the departed walked freely among the living. Baya, with its boiling springs and sulphur-scented air, embodied this liminal space, not heaven, not hell, but threshold. The Oracle Tomb is one of the few surviving places where that belief feels tangible. To descend its corridor is to join a lineage of seekers, pilgrims, emperors, and perhaps even the mad, all of whom came not to find treasure, but truth. Or at least, a glimpse of it. What did they hear in that chamber? What did they ask of the Sibyl? What price did they pay for prophecy? We may never know. And perhaps that's the point. In an age obsessed with proof, Baya reminds us of something sacred, that some experiences were never meant to be fully understood. Some structures were built not to house answers, but to cradle questions, safely, in silence, in stone. So the Oracle Tomb remains. Part myth, part monument, part mirror, reflecting our eternal fascination with what lies beyond. It is a whisper carved into the earth, a ritual still alive in shadow, a gate that never fully closes, and for those who dare to enter, it still waits. She could flip, twist, or soar, Simone Biles had to survive. Born on March 14, 1997 in Columbus, Ohio, Simone Ariane Biles entered a world marked by instability. Her biological mother struggled with addiction, and Simone, along with her siblings, was placed in and out of foster care. There were moments of separation, uncertainty, and upheaval. For most children, such an environment can be overwhelming. But even in these early fragile years, Simone's spark began to flicker. That spark found its fuel when she was just 3 years old. Simone and her siblings were taken in by their maternal grandfather, Ron Biles, and his wife Nellie, a nurse and businesswoman. Eventually, Ron and Nellie officially adopted Simone and her sister Adria, giving them not just legal guardianship, but safety, structure, and unconditional love. To Simone, they were never stand-ins. They were, and are, Mom and Dad. It was in their Houston, Texas home that Simone's new life began to take root. One day, during a daycare field trip to a local gym, young Simone saw something that lit her up inside. Tumbling mats, spring floors, and athletes flipping through the air like it was second nature. She couldn't sit still. She mimicked the moves on the sidelines until a coach handed her a note, suggesting she be enrolled in classes. That note changed everything. Simone's natural abilities were apparent almost immediately. She had explosive power, an uncanny sense of balance, and what coaches later called air awareness. the rare ability to always know where her body was mid-flight. But more than that, she had a relentless work ethic and an unmistakable joy when she moved. Gymnastics wasn't just an activity, it was where she came alive. By the age of 6, she was training seriously. By 8, coaches whispered about her potential. She was still a little girl, small, quiet, with a shy smile. But on the mat, she was fearless. Her past was turbulent, her future uncertain. But gymnastics gave her control, focus, and purpose. Simone Biles wasn't born into privilege. She was born into adversity. But she didn't just rise above it. She flipped over it, twisting her pain into fuel. Long before she was a champion, she was already defying gravity. Simone Biles's rise wasn't an accident. It was a perfect collision of talent, opportunity, and tenacity, sharpened by years of discipline and sacrifice. After that daycare field trip sparked her interest, Simone began training seriously at Bannon's Gymnastics in Houston. It wasn't long before her coaches realized they were watching something special, not just raw skill, but an unteachable blend of fearlessness, explosive strength, and something rarer still, joy in the face of challenge. By the age of 8, Simone was performing skills years ahead of her peers. Her small stature, eventually just 4'8", gave her a physical advantage. She could rotate faster, spring higher, and execute twists with an almost supernatural sense of air awareness. But none of it came easy. Her coaches pushed her. The routines got harder. And Simone, with her quiet drive, just kept pushing back. One of the most influential figures in her early life was coach Amy Borman, who began training Simone when she was a young girl and continued guiding her through her rise to stardom. Borman didn't just teach Simone gymnastics. She taught her how to be a competitor, how to channel energy, silence doubt, and turn nerves into power. Theirs was a partnership built on trust, patience, and mutual respect. While many elite gymnasts trained through intense, even rigid systems, Simone's training was tailored to her well-being. Her parents and Borman protected her childhood, even as she entered a sport that often erases it. Simone was homeschooled to allow for more flexible training hours, but her life wasn't consumed by gymnastics alone. She loved pizza, spending time with her siblings, and doing backflips in the backyard for fun. She was grounded by faith, family, and laughter. By 14, Simone was already turning heads in junior elite competitions. Her routines were packed with difficulty and risk, moves most girls wouldn't attempt, let alone perfect. She didn't just complete skills, she exploded through them, making even the hardest combinations look effortless. But Simone's greatest strength wasn't just physical, it was mental. She had a quiet confidence, a deep internal compass, and a refusal to be anything but herself. Her foundation wasn't fame. It was forged in sweat, family, and the kind of belief that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Simone wasn't just learning gymnastics. She was building the tools that would redefine the sport. By 2013, Simone Biles was no longer just a rising star. She was a force hurtling toward the global stage, unstoppable and uncompromising. That year, at just 16 years old, she stepped into the senior elite level and headed to the World Artistic Gymnastics Championships in Antwerp, Belgium. What happened there would change the course of her life and the history of gymnastics. Simone didn't just win. She stunned the world. She claimed 2 gold medals, including the coveted all-around title, instantly establishing herself as the best gymnast on the planet. Her routines were not only technically superior, they were daring, filled with skills no one else attempted. Her tumbling passes defied physics. Her landings were solid. Her movements were crisp, powerful, and uniquely hers. Suddenly, people realized this wasn't just a new champion. This was a gymnast operating in an entirely new dimension, and she was just getting started. Over the next few years, Simone would go on to dominate the sport in a way no woman ever had. From 2013 to 2016, she won 3 consecutive all-around world championship titles, a feat never accomplished before by an American woman. Her consistency was unshakable. Her routines were upgraded year after year, and her scores soared far above her peers. She made the impossible look routine. But it wasn't just her difficulty that set her apart. It was her presence. Simone competed with joy. While others showed nerves, she smiled. She danced between skills with a kind of radiance that lit up the arena. Audiences weren't just watching a gymnast. They were witnessing an evolution. Commentators, judges, and even former Olympians agreed. Simone Biles wasn't just winning competitions. She was redefining the very nature of women's gymnastics. Her rise also came at a time when the sport was shifting. The old standards of rigid beauty and passive performance were being replaced by power, personality, and authenticity, all of which Simone embodied. She didn't try to conform. She made the sport bend around her. And so, by the time the world began preparing for the 2016 Olympics, one thing was certain. Simone Biles wasn't just the favourite. She was the future. By the summer of 2016, Simone Biles was no longer just a gymnastics sensation. She was a global icon in the making. The world turned its attention to Rio de Janeiro, where the Olympic Games promised to be her coronation. Years of training, pressure, and anticipation had built toward this moment. And Simone delivered not just medals, but a performance that would redefine greatness in the sport. She entered the competition with sky-high expectations, and somehow soared even higher. Over the course of the Games, Simone captured 4 gold medals and 1 bronze, the most medals by an American gymnast at a single Olympics in over 30 years. She dominated the all-around vault floor exercise and contributed to the US team's dominant gold medal performance in the team final, famously dubbed the Final Five. But it wasn't just what she won. It was how she won. Her routines included moves so difficult that the scoring system had to evolve to accommodate them. On vault, she launched into the air with such power that it looked as if gravity paused to admire her. On floor, her signature move, the Biles, a double layout with a half twist, became an instant classic. Her artistry met brute force in a way gymnastics had never fully seen before. Crowds roared. Commentators searched for comparisons. But Simone Biles wasn't like anyone else. She was creating a new standard. Even fellow gymnasts watched in awe, not with envy, but with respect. They knew they were witnessing something rare, a complete gymnast in total command of her craft. And yet, off the mat, Simone remained grounded. She shared goofy selfies with teammates, laughed through press conferences, and gave credit to her coaches, her parents, and her faith. She wasn't just a competitor, she was a role model. Her success in Rio wasn't just historic, it was transformative. It shifted public perception of what women athletes could be: powerful, joyous, unapologetically dominant. She became the first woman of color to win Olympic all-around gold for the US, breaking barriers not just in skill, but in visibility and representation. Simone Biles didn't just win the Olympics in Rio, she owned them, with grace, grit, and greatness. After Rio, Simone Biles didn't just return home as a champion, she returned as a global phenomenon. She was no longer only known within the world of gymnastics. She had become a household name, a symbol of excellence, and a cultural icon. But with glory came new challenges: the weight of fame, the expectations of perfection, and the quiet, growing pressure to keep going when the body and the mind needed rest. In the months following the Olympics, Simone's life changed rapidly. She went on a national tour with her teammates, made countless TV appearances, and even competed on Dancing with the Stars. She published a memoir, Courage to Soar, which became a bestseller. Endorsements rolled in. Magazine covers, red carpet events, interviews. Simone had become a star far beyond her sport. But beneath the bright lights, a different reality was setting in. For the first time in years, Simone was off the competition floor. And with that pause came reflection. Who was she outside of gymnastics? What did she want now that she had achieved everything the sport could offer? The pressure didn't disappear. It evolved. Now, every move she made was scrutinized, every comeback questioned, every competition came with the unspoken expectation: Simone Biles must win. But Simone is not built for complacency. By 2018, she returned to training and competition with renewed intensity. And she returned not as a girl chasing a dream, but as a woman reclaiming her voice. At the 2018 US National Championships, she competed with 2 broken toes and a kidney stone. Most athletes wouldn't have even stepped onto the mat. Simone not only competed, she won, with scores that blew away the competition. Her performance wasn't just dominant, it was defiant. Still, something deeper was stirring beneath the surface. The world saw the medals, the smiles, the gravity-defying flips. But few knew the emotional cost of being the greatest. The trauma of the sport's dark underbelly was beginning to surface. And Simone, more than anyone, was feeling the burden of carrying both the sport's future and its painful past. The time after Rio wasn't just about sustaining greatness. It was about surviving it. And in that space between triumph and truth, Simone Biles began to discover a different kind of strength. One rooted not in performance, but in vulnerability. For all her athletic power, Simone Biles' most courageous moment didn't happen on a balance beam or beneath the Olympic rings. It happened with a microphone in front of the world when she chose to speak the truth. Not about medals, but about trauma. In 2018, Simone Biles revealed that she was one of the hundreds of gymnasts abused by former USA gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar, a man who had preyed on athletes for decades under the guise of medical care. Simone's decision to speak out wasn't easy. She was, by then, the face of the sport, the brightest star in an organization now deeply tarnished. But she refused to stay silent. In a statement posted online, she wrote, "I am not afraid to tell my story anymore." It was more than a confession. It was a declaration. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for all the girls who had been hurt, silenced, and ignored. She demanded accountability, not just from Nassar, but from USA Gymnastics and the US Olympic Committee, which had enabled his abuse through negligence and cover-ups. In doing so, Simone transformed from champion to changemaker. Her courage resonated far beyond the gym. Survivors around the world saw their own pain reflected in her voice. Fellow athletes rallied behind her. Lawmakers began to investigate. And the image of Simone testifying before Congress in 2021, tearful yet composed, became an indelible moment in American sports history. But even as she fought for justice, Simone kept training. She continued to dominate competitions, all while carrying the weight of a broken system on her shoulders. Her performance became about more than gold. It was now about healing, resistance, and truth. Simone redefined strength not as stoicism but as honesty. She showed that the greatest athletes aren't those who never struggle, they're the ones who rise anyway. She blurred the line between hero and human, proving you can be both. Through her voice, Simone did what even her most difficult vaults couldn't. She shattered the silence. And in that silence, a new definition of power emerged, one that didn't need applause to matter. She wasn't just flipping through the air anymore. She was changing the ground beneath us. When the Tokyo Olympics finally arrived in 2021, delayed a year by the global pandemic, Simone Biles stood as the undisputed face of the Games. The world expected dominance, another sweep of golds, and more physics-defying feats. But instead, Simone gave us something far more important, a lesson in courage that had nothing to do with medals. In the middle of the team competition, after a shaky vault, Simone withdrew. At first, the announcement stunned the world. Then came the explanation. She was experiencing a condition gymnasts dread: the twisties. It's a mental block where the body and brain lose synchronization mid-air. For an average person, it's hard to grasp. For a gymnast performing flips and twists 10 feet above the ground, it's a matter of life and death. Suddenly, the strongest athlete in the world had said the unthinkable. I need to step back. And she did. Her decision sent shockwaves across the Olympic stage. Critics questioned her toughness. Pundits debated. But athletes, across every sport, rallied in support. They knew the cost. They understood the courage it takes to say, not today. Simone didn't disappear after withdrawing. She showed up every day in the arena, cheering for her teammates, supporting them, smiling, crying. She became a beacon, not just of what it means to compete, but what it means to be human under pressure. Days later, she returned for one final event, the balance beam final, and performed a simplified routine, earning a bronze medal. But the real triumph wasn't on the podium. It was in her choice to protect her mental health in front of the entire world. Simone flipped the script on what strength means. In a culture obsessed with pushing through pain, she offered a different model: wisdom, self-awareness, and radical vulnerability. She reminded us that even the most decorated athletes are not machines. They're people. People with limits, trauma, and needs. And that recognizing those limits isn't weakness. It's the deepest form of strength. In Tokyo, Simone didn't win 4 gold medals, but she gave something far more lasting. She gave permission to pause, to protect oneself, and to choose well-being over expectation. After Tokyo, many wondered if Simone Biles would ever return to competition. She had already transcended the sport, not just as the most decorated gymnast in history, but as a symbol of resilience and honesty. But Simone wasn't finished, not with gymnastics, and not with her own story. For over a year, she stepped back from the competitive world. She focused on healing, mentally, emotionally, physically. She went to therapy. She spoke at mental health events. She inspired athletes across disciplines to reevaluate what winning really means. And in 2023, quietly but powerfully, she made her return. When Simone walked back into the arena at the US Classic in August 2023, it felt less like a comeback and more like a homecoming. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't chasing medals. She was doing it on her terms. And still, she dominated. In that meet, and later at the 2023 US Gymnastics Championships, Simone not only won, she stunned the world again with her athletic evolution. She debuted new routines. She performed the Yurchenko double pike vault, a move so difficult and dangerous that few men attempt it. Once again, a skill was named after her. Once again, Simone had pushed the boundaries of what the human body can do. But this version of Simone was different. There was more laughter, more stillness, more choice. She was no longer just the greatest of all time. She was a woman in control of her narrative, deciding when to perform, how to perform, and why. Off the mat, her life flourished too. In 2023, she married NFL safety Jonathan Owens in a private ceremony, later celebrated with a grand destination wedding. She spoke openly about love, joy, and the challenges of balancing elite sport with normal life. Her relationship became another symbol, not of perfection, but of grounding, of being seen and supported beyond the spotlight. Simone's return wasn't about reclaiming titles. It was about reclaiming herself. And in doing so, she redefined what longevity looks like in a sport notorious for burning out young athletes. She didn't come back as the girl who had something to prove. She came back as the woman who had already proven everything and still chose to rise. Simone Biles is, by every measurable standard, the most decorated gymnast in history. With over 30 world and Olympic medals, including 4 skills named after her, she has redefined the limits of the sport, not just by winning, but by reshaping what greatness means. And yet, Her true legacy extends far beyond the medals, the routines, or even the accolades. Simone Biles has changed the culture of gymnastics. Before her, power was admired, but artistry was favoured. After her, the standard shifted. She made it impossible to ignore that strength, difficulty, and confidence are just as beautiful as grace. She didn't just raise the bar, she launched it into the air, spun around it twice, and landed with a smile. And then she asked, "What's next?" She has become a blueprint, not just for gymnasts, but for athletes across every sport. Her advocacy for mental health, athlete safety, and self-worth has inspired a movement. She showed that stepping away is not failure, that protecting your peace is a radical act of self-respect, and that even in silence, you can speak volumes. Young gymnasts now grow up not just admiring Simone's skill, but emulating her strength of character. She has shown them that it's okay to say no, to ask for help, to define success for yourself. In a world that demands constant performance, she offered something braver, authenticity, and she's still going. Whether she continues to compete through another Olympic cycle or chooses a different path, her mark on gymnastics, and on society, is permanent. Museums are displaying her leotards, books are being written about her, and children across the world are learning to cartwheel because they saw her do it. Simone Biles isn't just the best gymnast the world has ever seen. She's a cultural shift wrapped in muscle and movement, a story of resilience, honesty, and quiet revolution. Her life proves that strength isn't measured by how much you carry, but by knowing when to set it down. That excellence means nothing without integrity, and that the most powerful flips are the ones that bring you back to yourself. Simone's story isn't finished, but even now, mid-vault, mid-flight, her legacy is already landing exactly where it belongs, in the hearts of those she's lifted, just by being herself.